Imagine trying to deep clean a frantic, blood-soaked murder scene in exactly 15 minutes.
Oh, wow. Yeah, like an impossibly short amount of time.
Right. You have to scrub every surface, wash yourself completely, and leave without a single microscopic drop of blood on your fingernails.
All of that.
Yeah, just so you can casually catch a tramp. And the crazy thing is, in 1931, a stoic insurance agent was condemned to hang because a jury genuinely believed he pulled off that exact impossible magic trick.
It really is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. I mean, it completely defies the fundamental rules of cause and effect we usually rely on to, solve a crime.
Exactly.
This is actually the case that the famed crime writer Raymond Chandler famously called the impossible murder.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, let's get into it.
So to understand why this murder scene completely broke the bounds of logic, you first really have to understand the incredibly rigid, mundane routine of the man who supposedly created it.
Right. We are looking at William Herbert Wallace. He's a 52-year-old insurance agent for the Prudential Assurance Company living in Liverpool.
And this is 1931, right?
Exactly, 1931.
Yeah.
So we are thick in the middle of the Great Depression.
Which is a huge factor.
It really is. Now, Wallace is widely described in the sources as stoic, aloof, and, well, a bit of a geek.
Yeah, he didn't really have many friends.
No, he didn't. He mostly spent his time tinkering as an amateur chemist. He actually had a makeshift laboratory set up in his home, which is pretty quirky.
Wait, really? A lab in his house?
Yeah, a full setup. And he was also teaching himself to play the violin.
That paints quite a picture.
Hmm.
So he lived at 29 Wolverton Street with his wife, Julia. Now, Julia was 69 years old, though there's evidence in the sources that Wallace actually thought she was closer to his own age of 52.
Which is an interesting little detail, yeah.
Yeah. But their neighbors and his superintendent, Joseph Crew, they all describe them as this devoted, loving couple.
Right, like there were no reports of domestic disputes at all.
None. No financial ruin hanging over their heads.
No.
Just a placid, incredibly routine-driven life.
And that routine was literally the defining characteristic of their existence. Every single day was mapped out.
Which makes any disruption a huge deal.
Exactly. Which is why the disruption on Monday, January 19th is so critical to the whole case.
Right.
The story doesn't actually kick off at their home, though. It starts at the City Cafe.
That's the local spot where Wallace's chess club held their matches, right?
Yep, exactly. Wallace wasn't a frequent regular there, but his schedule was posted publicly on the club's notice board because he was set to play in the second-class championship that specific night.
Okay, so anyone could walk in and see exactly where he'd be.
Anyone.
That is so creepy. So according to the transcript from Samuel Beatty, he was the captain of the chess club, the cafe receives a phone call at around 7:15 p.m.
All right, the waitress answers first.
Yeah, the waitress answers, but the caller asks specifically for Wallace. Since Wallace hasn't arrived yet, she just hands the receiver over to Beatty.
And Beatty gets on the line, and the caller identifies himself as R.M. Qualtrough.
Qualtrough. Such a distinct name.
It is. Beatty later testified under oath that this Qualtrough character had a strong, confident, and somewhat gruff voice.
Gruff voice, okay.
Yeah, and Qualtrough tells Beatty he wants to discuss a business matter, an endowment insurance policy with Wallace.
So Beatty asks the obvious question, can you just call back later?
Which makes sense.
Right. But Qualtrough says no, he's far too busy because he's currently at his daughter's 21st birthday party.
So specific.
So specific. He insists that Beatty take a message, instructing Wallace to meet him the very next evening at 7:30 p.m. at a specific address, which was 25 Menlove Gardens East.
So Wallace finally arrives at the cafe, sits down, and plays his chess match.
And he actually wins, right?
He does, yeah. He grinds it out and wins after like 2.5 hours. Then Beatty hands him the message.
And Wallace's reaction is just total confusion. He tells Beatty he has no idea who Qualtrough is, and more importantly, he doesn't know where Menlove Gardens East is.
Right, because Menlove Avenue is this massive, sprawling road in Liverpool, but Wallace isn't familiar with the specific gardens attached to it.
But, during the Great Depression, the prospect of a new commission on an endowment policy for a 21st birthday, that's an incredibly tempting financial hook. So Wallace writes the address down.
Yeah, he takes the bait.
It feels exactly like getting a highly specific, targeted phishing scam text today,
Yeah.
long before the internet existed.
Oh, that's a perfect comparison.
Just someone dangling the exact piece of bait you want just to get you out of your house. But here's the crazy part. The police later theorized that Wallace made this phone call himself to create a fake alibi.
Which is wild.
I have to push back on that logic immediately. If Wallace made the call, Wouldn't his own chess captain, Samuel Beatty, have recognized his voice on the phone?
This raises an important question, right? It really highlights the glaring flaw in the prosecution's initial theory, and the transcript highlights it perfectly.
Right, because they knew each other.
Oh, Beatty had known Wallace for 8 years. On the stand, when the defense asked if the voice sounded anything like Wallace, Beatty unequivocally replied that it would take a great stretch of the imagination to say it was him.
Wow. A great stretch of the imagination.
Exactly. Furthermore, investigators actually traced the call to a public phone box just 400 yards from Wallace's home.
Which means the police were asking the jury to believe that Wallace left his house, walked to the phone box, disguised his voice so flawlessly that he fooled a man he'd known for almost a decade.
Great, a total voice actor performance.
Exactly. Hung up and then casually walked into the cafe 25 minutes later to play a grueling chess match.
It just doesn't add up. So why did the police so quickly abandon the idea that a third party made that call? Almost from day one, they just assumed Wallace's guilt.
Yeah, they really did.
Instead of letting the physical evidence guide their investigation, they began forcing the facts to fit their preconceived narrative.
And the danger of that tunnel vision becomes glaringly obvious the very next night, Tuesday, January 20th. Wallace has his tea, tells Julia to bolt the back door behind him, which the transcripts note was their standard security routine, by the way.
Just a normal habit for them.
Right. And he heads out into the freezing Liverpool night to find this Mr. Qualtrough.
And we actually have the verbatim transcripts from the tram conductors, Thomas Phillips and Arthur Thompson.
Oh, this part is so frustrating to read.
It really is. Wallace takes a series of trams and repeatedly asks them to make sure he gets off at Menlove Gardens East. He explicitly tells them he's a complete stranger to the area and is looking for a client.
So he gets off the tram and just starts wandering around the Mossley Hill neighborhood in the pitch dark.
Just completely lost.
Yeah. He knocks on the door of a local resident, Katie Mather, who lives at 25 Menlove Gardens West, to ask for directions. He asks a clerk in a local newsstand, where he actually pulls out a directory to check the address.
He's trying everything.
He really is. He even flags down a police officer, Sergeant, at 7:45 p.m. to ask where the street is.
And every single one of those people tells him the exact same thing. There is a Menlove Gardens North, a South, and a West.
But no east.
There is no Menlove Gardens East. It simply does not exist.
The ultimate wild goose chase.
Uh,
So, realizing he's been had, Wallace takes the tram back home. He arrives at his house on Wolverton Street at about 8:45 p.m.
okay.
And this is where he runs into his neighbors, John and Florence Johnston, who just happen to be walking out of their house into the back alley.
Right, and the Johnsons notice Wallace lingering by his gate. He tells them both the front and back doors are locked against him, which is highly unusual for him and Julia.
So John Johnston suggests he try the back door one more time.
And the transcript of what happens next is just chilling.
It really is. Wallace goes up to the back door, grasps the handle, and calls back over his shoulder. It opens now.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. He walks into the dark house while the Johnstons wait outside in the alley. They see a light flick on in the upstairs bedroom, then the flicker of a match in Wallace's upstairs laboratory.
And then he comes back down.
A few moments later, Wallace comes hurrying back out to the yard. He looks at them and says, "Come and see. She is killed."
The Johnstons follow him inside, and in the small front parlor, they find Julia Wallace. She has been brutally bludgeoned to death.
It's awful.
The scene is incredibly violent. The forensic expert noted that the blows were frenzied, completely shattering her skull. There is massive arterial blood spatter on the walls, reaching up to 7 feet high.
And bizarrely, tucked under her body, there is a partially burned raincoat.
Yeah, which makes no sense.
Then, Wallace begins checking the house. In the kitchen, a locked cash box kept on a high shelf has been wrenched open. But only about 4 pounds is missing.
Right, just a tiny amount.
Exactly. Upstairs, a jar containing 5 pounds is sitting in plain sight, completely untouched.
Which contradicts a standard burglary. I mean, if it was a robbery, why leave the money upstairs? Why light a raincoat on fire?
Good questions.
Because physical clues were so scarce, the spatial analysis of the room become crucial. And here, we encounter the absolute disaster of the crime scene investigation.
Oh man, the contamination of this crime scene is mind-blowing. When you read the testimony of the police photographer, Harry Hewitt Cook, he casually admits that a chair blocking the parlor door was moved by the police before they took the second photograph.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, just so he could get a better angle of the room.
And that move chair completely destroyed any ability to understand how the killer entered or exited the parlor.
It ruins the whole spatial context.
Exactly.
Yeah.
On top of that, the investigating officers neglected to wear gloves. Their fingerprints were found everywhere, smudging out potential evidence. Because the physical scene was so poorly preserved, forensic reconstruction was effectively impossible.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. If you take a step back and look at Wallace's behavior that night, constantly telling the tram conductors, don't forget I want Men Love Gardens East, checking his watch in front of a police officer, knocking on random doors.
Yeah.
Is that the overacting of a guilty man methodically building an ironclad alibi? Or is it just the natural behavior of a meticulous, slightly geeky guy who is genuinely lost in the dark, desperate to make a business appointment?
And that is the insidious nature of circumstantial evidence. Every single action Wallace took can be interpreted in two completely opposing ways, depending entirely on the lens of guilt or innocence you view it through.
Exactly.
But regardless of how the police interpreted his demeanor, the prosecution still faced a massive hurdle. They had to prove he actually had the physical time to commit the murder.
Yes, the timeline. Because the physical evidence was hopelessly contaminated, this entire case hinged on the clock.
Yeah.
And the math the prosecution relied on is just wild.
It really is. It centers on a 14-year-old milk boy named Alan Close. According to his testimony, he delivered milk to the Wallace home that evening. He distinctly remembered passing the Holy Trinity church clock at exactly 6:25 p.m.
Very precise.
Right. And the police literally walked his route with him, timed it with a stopwatch, and found it took exactly 5 minutes.
Which puts the milk boy on the Wallace's doorstep at 6:30 p.m. Other witnesses, like a girl he passed on the street, suggested it might have been even later, closer to 6:4 p.m.
Okay, sure.
But let's take the prosecution's absolute best-case scenario for their timeline. 6:30 p.m., Alan Close knocks on the door, Julia Wallace opens it, takes the milk, and speaks to him. She is alive and well.
Right. And we also know from tram company records and witness sightings that Wallace was securely on a tram heading out of his neighborhood by 7:06 p.m.
Okay.
To make that tram calculating normal walking speed, he had to leave his house no later than 6:50 p.m.
So let me get this straight. If Julia is alive at 6:30 and Wallace is out the door by 6:50, that gives him a maximum of 20 minutes, maybe as little as 5 minutes, to commit the crime.
Yeah.
Think about the mechanics of what that entails. He has to brutally bludgeon his wife in the parlor. He has to stage a robbery by wrenching open the cash tin. Then he has to completely clean himself of the massive blood spatter.
And we need to talk about how the police tested for that blood, too. They didn't just eyeball his clothes, they used the benzidine test.
What's that?
Benzidine is a chemical that reacts instantly with the iron in hemoglobin, turning a vivid, undeniable blue. It's incredibly sensitive. It can detect blood that has been scrubbed, washed, or heavily diluted.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yet, when they tested the suit Wallace was wearing that night, nothing. Not a single blue speck.
That's crazy.
They checked the drains in the bathroom to see if he washed up. They found no evidence of anyone washing off blood aside from one tiny, natural clot in the toilet bowl.
It's like trying to deep clean your entire house in the 15 minutes before dinner guests arrive. But instead of hiding some dust, you're trying to erase a gruesome murder scene without leaving a trace on your fingernails or dropping a single flake of evidence into the sink trap. It completely defies logic.
It totally does. But then the prosecution brought in their medical expert, Dr. John McFall. His forensic work in this case is a textbook example of bad science. He estimated the time of death based almost entirely on rigor mortis.
Which is pretty unreliable.
Highly unreliable. Rigor mortis is the stiffening of muscles after death, but the rate at which it sets in depends heavily on the room's temperature, the victim's body mass, and whether they died in the middle of a frantic, adrenaline-fueled struggle.
Right, there's so many variables.
Exactly. You cannot just touch a stiff arm and declare a time of death like a train schedule. Yet, McFall confidently declared she died around 8:00 p.m.
8:00 p.m., which is mathematically impossible for Wallace, because at 8:00 p.m. he was miles away, standing on a street corner, literally talking to police officer Sergeant.
Exactly. And when confronted with this impossibility, McFall backtracked and tried to push his estimate closer to 6:00 p.m.
But wait, that directly contradicts the milk boy who interacted with Julia, alive and well, at 6:30?
Right. The forensic timeline was a contradictory mess.
So what does this all mean? How does a jury sit through this trial hearing about a phantom caller recognized by a friend as definitely not being Wallace, looking at a bungled crime scene and tracking a mathematical timeline that practically proves he couldn't have done it, and still convict the guy.
It ultimately came down to the psychological narrative woven by the prosecutor, Edward Hemmard.
The psychological narrative.
Yeah, he painted a picture of Wallace as a cold, calculating mastermind. He suggested Wallace stripped naked or wore the raincoat found under Julia's body to shield his suit from the blood.
That's such a leap.
But more than anything, the jury was put off by Wallace's stoicism. He didn't act like a weeping, hysterical widower. He just sat calmly in the dock, taking notes.
And the trial judge, Mr. Justice Wright, saw right through that emotional manipulation. The transcript shows him practically begging the jury to acquit.
He really tried.
He explicitly instructed them that a man cannot be convicted on mere probabilities, pointing out that the physical evidence was entirely consistent with an unknown criminal entering the house.
And yet, the jury completely ignored the judge's warning. After just 1 hour of deliberation, they returned a verdict of guilty. Wallace was sentenced to hang.
So the jury condemns a man to death based on zero physical evidence and a mathematically broken timeline. How does the justice system even course correct from a failure that spectacular?
Through an unprecedented intervention by the Court of Criminal Appeal, in May 1931, Lord Chief Justice Hewart utilized Section 4.1 of the Criminal Appeal Act 1907 to quash the conviction.
Which was huge, right?
Massive. Up until this exact moment in history, an appeals court usually only intervened if the trial judge made a procedural error like, misreading a law to the jury.
But here, the Lord Chief Justice looked at the evidence itself and basically said, no, the jury's interpretation of the facts is simply wrong.
Exactly the opposite of their usual restraint. The court ruled that the verdict cannot be supported having regard to the evidence. It was the first time in British legal history a murder conviction was overturned strictly on the grounds that the evidence didn't justify the jury's conclusion. They declared they would not uphold a conviction founded on mere suspicion.
So Wallace is a free man. But the burning question remains, if Wallace didn't do it, who did? Who knew his schedule well enough to set up the Qualtrough call? And who had the opportunity to slip in and kill Julia?
The most prominent alternative suspect is a man named Richard Gordon Perry. He was a 21-year-old former colleague of Wallace's at the Prudential.
He is a genuinely shadowy figure. Perry knew Wallace's collection routes perfectly. He knew the schedule of the chess club, which, again, was posted publicly on a notice board right inside the city cafe.
Very convenient.
And crucially, Perry had previously been caught embezzling money from his own Prudential collections.
Right. Wallace's superintendent confirmed that Perry's parents had to step in and secretly repay the company to cover his stolen deficiencies.
So he was desperate.
Perry needed money. He knew Wallace regularly collected significant amounts of cash, sometimes holding up to £100 a week in his home, and he knew the exact layout of the Wallace house.
But the detail that really gives you chills comes from the Mental Floss article regarding a local garage mechanic named John Parks.
Oh, this is a highly compelling piece of circumstantial evidence. On the night of the murder, around 1 a.m., Parks claimed that Perry showed up at his garage in an incredibly agitated state.
Okay.
He demanded that Parks aggressively hose down both the inside and the outside of his car.
Parks opens the car door to clean it and sees a heavily blood-stained glove inside. And according to Parks, Perry muttered something about having dropped an iron bar down a local street train, saying, if the police get that, they would hang me.
What's fascinating here is how the police handled Perry's alibi, because they did bring him in for questioning.
Right.
Perry claimed he was with his fiancée, Lily Lloyd, on the night of the murder, and she corroborated his story. Years later, when the two broke up, Lily Lloyd allegedly went to Wallace's lawyers and confessed that she had completely fabricated the alibi at Perry's request.
That is huge.
But yet, because the police had developed such intense tunnel vision regarding Wallace from day one, they barely scratched the surface of Perry's timeline.
Okay, but I have to push back on the John Parks testimony.
Huh.
Parks didn't tell this story about the bloody glove to the police in 1931. He waited 50 years.
Yeah, he did.
He told a journalist in 1980, literally right after Perry died. As a listener trying to weigh these sources, how reliable is a witness who waits half a century to mention a bloody glove and a confessed murder weapon?
It's a very fair critique of human memory and witness reliability. I get that. However, if we connect this to the bigger picture, Liverpool in the 1930s was an incredibly tough, gritty place. Perry was known to have a criminal history involving theft and was widely perceived as a dangerous local thug. Parks claimed he stayed silent out of genuine paralyzing fear for his life, waiting until Perry was dead and could no longer retaliate.
Which is such a dark, ironic contrast to Wallace. The jury wasn't afraid of the stoic, quiet insurance agent, so they had no problem condemning him to hang. But the mechanic is absolutely terrified of the actual thug, so he stays quiet for 50 years.
It perfectly illustrates the atmospheric pressure of the case. And logistically, a younger, fitter man like Perry, perhaps with an accomplice, could have easily slipped into the house.
Yep, that makes sense.
He could have used the guise of an insurance inquiry to get Julia to open the door, or perhaps he surprised her while attempting to steal the collection box. It explains the missing £4, the frenzied nature of the attack if she recognized him, and how a perpetrator escaped the impossibly tight 15-minute timeline that ensnared Wallace.
So, William Wallace is cleared by the highest court in the land. But the court of public opinion in his hometown never really acquitted him. He couldn't go back to his old life.
No, he was entirely ostracized. He received hate mail, and people would literally cross the street to avoid walking near him.
That's heartbreaking.
Tragically, just 2 years after his historic acquittal, Wallace died of the chronic kidney disease he had been suffering from for years. He died brokenhearted and completely alone. And to this day, almost a century later, no one else has ever been charged with the murder of Julia Wallace.
Which leaves us with a truly haunting mystery. We've looked at the bungled forensics, the impossible 15-minute timeline, the phantom Qualtrough call, and the shadowy figure of Gordon Perry. But I want to leave you with a final thought that really gets under my skin about this whole affair.
Yeah.
This case forces us to confront a terrifying paradox within the justice system itself. Think about it. The very traits that typically indicate innocence, having a tight, verifiable alibi, maintaining a calm, stoic demeanor in the face of an unimaginable tragedy, and possessing a methodical, analytical mind are the exact same traits that a prejudiced public and a zealous prosecutor will use to paint you as a cold, calculating mastermind.
Right. If you don't break down crying, they think you're a psychopath.
Exactly. If you don't perform your grief exactly the way a jury expects you to, your natural innocence is weaponized against you. So, if you were ever falsely accused of the unthinkable, would your natural reactions save you, or would they condemn you? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources of the Wallace case. We wish you well until our next exploration.